I'd like to talk about the NDP and make some comparisons between the NDP in Saskatchewan and British Columbia. I've had the opportunity of living in both places, so I perhaps can make some observation on the similarities, but also the differences. The CCF NDP, I guess, was in Saskatchewan much longer than it has been in BC. And the CCF NDP was primarily a farmer-based organization to start with, whereas the NDP in BC is primarily a labor-based organization. And I think therein lies the biggest difference. If you go back to Saskatchewan in the after the Depression, when the CCF under Tommy Douglas was first elected, the province was almost bankrupt. This was at the end after the 30s. There was a big growth for 10 years, and crop prices with the worldwide depression were very, very low, and the province was almost bankrupt. And so the CCF had a plan for implementing various programs. Just to give you an example, Tommy Douglas is generally considered to be the father of Medicare. And the reason for that is he talked about it right from the time he was elected I forget the exact year, but the early 40s. But in fact, he wasn't, 13 years later, when he left Saskatchewan to become the leader of the NDP federally, Medicare had still not been introduced into Saskatchewan, but yet he's considered to be the father of Medicare. Well, the reason even though he talked about it and it wasn't in place, is because the province's finances did not enable that to happen. And being a fiscally conservative government, they waited until they had their finances in place before they introduced Medicare. In actual fact, it was Woodrow Lloyd as a premier and Alan Blakeney as the Minister of Health. They were the ones who brought in Medicare, and Tommy Douglas had already gone to Ottawa to head up the federal NDP. But it's because Tommy Douglas, and I think rightly so, Tommy Douglas talked about the need for a Medicare program right from the beginning. But they waited something like 14 years before they put it in place. They waited until they had their finances in order. Now, that's got to be an indication of a fiscally conservative government, that they had to get their finances in place before they could introduce the social programs that they thought were important. So that's probably observation number one. The other thing to remember is that in Saskatchewan in the 60s, 70s, and maybe early 80s, most of the people voted NDP provincially, and they voted Conservative federally. I think almost all of the seats, with perhaps one exception, in federal elections went to the Conservatives, even though they had an NDP government provincially. So I think that is an indication that the voters of Saskatchewan were fiscally conservative. They found that federally the Conservatives looked after their interests best, and provincially they felt that the NDP was able to provide the kind of services they needed in a fiscally conservative manner. For instance, electricity and telephones. Most of Saskatchewan was rural in those days, and you really couldn't expect a private company to put in electrical lines to service rural Saskatchewan, or telephone lines for that matter. The costs were too great, and even if a private company did put in a power line, a power service to the farms, there would be no control over the pricing of the electricity. And so people realized that relying on the free market forces to provide electricity and telephone was not going to be a practical solution. And so when the NDP proposed programs excuse me, to put rural electrification in place and rural telephone systems, this was a very desirable thing to have happen. It was a service that was needed, and the only practical way of doing it in a practical way was to have it being done by government. Now, the other option would be a cooperative, and of course there were many examples of that as well. Farmers realized that when they had, back in the 30s, if they had a private grain elevator in their town, they were pretty much beholden to that company in terms of what price they got for their grain. And they realized, and they hauled their grain to the elevator with a team of horses. So it wasn't really practical for them to shop around to find another location to sell their grain. And so they realized that the only real solution to that was to form their own cooperative, the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool. And so that was put into place. And the same, to a lesser extent, for the provision of feed and oil and gas and this sort of thing. Many of the farmers put their efforts behind co-ops and the formation of federated co-ops. All of that was done to provide services to the farmers of rural Saskatchewan. Same thing with credit unions. There are far more people who who have their business with credit unions than they do with the big five banks. And again, the reason is that in small towns, the big banks either would have a monopoly or they close shop, and there was no service. And so it was an obvious thing to build credit unions so that people could get a service. So that sort of gives the background. The farmers and the people of Saskatchewan wanted services, and they couldn't get the level of service that they required from private companies. And so they took it upon themselves to find a way to provide that service on their own, either through cooperatives or through their CCF NDP government. In the rest of Canada, particularly in BC, the NDP has got its support primarily from labor unions. Nurses certainly, and certainly teachers certainly. In fact, I'm just almost aghast at the way in which the teachers union in BC operate. It's almost unbelievable, the outright bias that they have towards the NDP, and probably to a lesser extent the nurses and some of the other public sector unions. So the NDP certainly in Ontario, in BC, is a labor-based organization. I suspect that there are very few farmers in BC who vote for the NDP, which of course isn't the situation in Saskatchewan. So that's a very significant difference. The people of Saskatchewan are small c conservative when it comes to business matters, and they find that the NDP provides that, meets their needs provincially, and when they vote federally, they're now voting. They have in the past and continue to, generally speaking, vote conservative. Things are changing. I don't think the NDP in Saskatchewan is quite the same party that was there when I was living in Saskatchewan some 20-odd years ago. I realize there are changes are occurring, but certainly the 20 to 30 to 40 years ago, when I was in Saskatchewan, that is my assessment and recollection of the way in which the NDP operated.